Today we're talking through a diesel engine from start to finish, from the air entering the intake to the exhaust leaving the stack, with everything in between. When I started in the heavy duty trade 15 years ago, learning how this process worked was a little overwhelming. So if you've ever wondered how all the parts of a diesel engine work together to produce huge amounts of torque and power, this lesson will connect those dots. And this whole process begins with air. In a diesel engine, air is the foundation of everything. No air, no combustion. But not all air is considered equal to a diesel. Outside air is full of dust, dirt, and debris. If this dirty air is allowed into the engine, major damage may occur, resulting in expensive repairs or replacement. Cleaning this dirty air, however, is the important job of the air filter. The air filter removes contaminants so only clean air is allowed to enter into the engine. A restricted or clogged filter means poor performance, excess fuel use, and black smoke. So that's why intake maintenance matters. After the filter, air flows through the intake ducting and ends up at one of the major components of the diesel intake system, the turbocharger. A turbo uses exhaust flow from the exhaust manifold after combustion, which we'll get to a little bit later, to spin a turbine. This turbine compresses the incoming filtered air, and this compressed air means more oxygen. More oxygen means more fuel can be burned inside the cylinder, and more fuel burned means more power and torque. Diesel engines rely heavily on turbocharging, which are engineered to make them more efficient and powerful. There is a downside to compressing all of that intake air. When air is compressed by the turbo, it heats up a lot, and hot air is less dense, meaning fewer oxygen molecules. So to solve that, we use an intercooler or charge air cooler. The charge air cooler cools the turbocharged air, increasing its density. Cooler air equals more oxygen, which equals cleaner, stronger combustion. And a charge air cooler is just a lot like a radiator, which I'm sure you've seen on a lot of your own vehicles. After leaving the charge air cooler, the air heads towards the intake manifold, where it is distributed to each cylinder through the cylinder head. The cylinder head is a major engine component of a diesel engine that sits on top of the engine block. It seals the top of the cylinders to form the combustion chamber. Within the cylinder head are valves which open and close to help with combustion, which we'll get to shortly. There are also fuel injectors along with coolant and oil passages to help keep things lubricated and cooled. But before we follow the intake air into the cylinder, we have to discuss some of the other major parts, starting with the piston. The piston moves up and down within the cylinder, and the combustion within the cylinder is what pushes the piston down to rotate the larger engine part known as the crankshaft. Diesel engine's main job is to create rotational movement, and it does this by pistons moving up and down, which are connected to another part called a connecting rod to create a rotating crankshaft. Okay, I get it. That is a lot of parts. There will be future videos with more details on these parts, but for now, let's get back to that intake air. Within the cylinder head, there are components called intake valves. These valves are timed to open when the cylinder is ready for that first stroke, which is called the intake stroke. You may have heard of 2 or 4-stroke engines at some point. 4-stroke engines require 4 separate strokes or movements of the piston to complete combustion. These include number 1, the intake stroke. Number 2, the compression stroke. Number 3, the power stroke. And number 4, the exhaust stroke. The piston moves down towards the bottom of the cylinder during the intake and the power strokes, and back up during the compression and exhaust strokes. Let's get back to the intake stroke. As the piston starts moving down, the intake valves open up, which allows that clean, cool, high-pressured air into the cylinder. And this is the intake stroke, stroke number 1. With the cylinder full of clean air, the intake valves then close completely, and now the piston starts to rise. As it climbs, it compresses the air into a tiny space at the top of the cylinder since there is nowhere for the air to escape to. But why does the air get compressed so much? If you're at all familiar with gasoline engines, you probably know that they use a spark plug to ignite that fuel-air mixture. But diesel engines use another method called compression ignition. This means that they don't actually have spark plugs, and instead they compress air so tightly that it skyrockets in temperature, often 900 to 1200 degrees Fahrenheit. And this heat is what actually ignites the fuel once it is injected. A gas engine might run at a compression ratio of 10 to 1, while a diesel usually sits between 16 to 1 and 22 to 1. And this high compression is why diesel engines need stronger blocks, pistons, rods, and crankshafts. But back to the compression stroke, because we're now approaching the most important moment, which is fuel injection. Diesel engines inject fuel directly into the combustion chamber at incredibly high pressures. This diesel fuel has traveled from the fuel tank through several filters, possibly a fuel cooler, and through one or more pumps to arrive ready for injection. At or near top dead center, when the piston is at the top of the stroke, closest to the cylinder head, the injector sprays a mist of fuel into the superheated air. Modern diesel engines use fuel pressures as high as 30,000 psi to inject into the cylinder. This ultrafine mist helps fuel vaporize and mix with the compressed air instantly. As soon as that vaporized fuel hits the hot air, it ignites. There's no spark plug, just a mix of heat, pressure, and finely atomized fuel. And this is where torque is born. And it's also stroke number 3, the power stroke. The burning fuel expands rapidly, which creates massive pressure. This pressure shoves the piston downward with force strong enough to turn the crankshaft. This rotational force of the crankshaft is known as torque, the diesel engine's specialty. Compared to gas engines, diesels produce more torque at lower RPMs, revolutions per minute, making them perfect for trucks, equipment, and heavy loads. After the power stroke, the fuel and air have combusted and they have created the byproduct, which is exhaust gas, which needs to leave the cylinder and leave the engine. At this point, the exhaust valve opens, the piston rises, and the burn gases exit the cylinder via the exhaust manifold, which is mounted on the other side of the cylinder head from the intake manifold. But this exhaust energy isn't wasted. Earlier on, we talked about the turbocharger. This exhaust gas is used to spin the turbocharger turbine, which in turn compresses more intake air. It's a self-boosting cycle where the exhaust energy helps to power the intake air. Now, we just talked about one 4-stroke cycle for one cylinder. Diesel engines in the heavy-duty applications are often having 6, 8, or 12 cylinders, but some applications may have less or more depending on how they're used. So imagine this one 4-stroke cycle we talked about happening multiple times per second in each cylinder, while all the other cylinders are performing the same thing, all timed and staggered at different times to create a balanced rotational movement out of the crankshaft. Pretty impressive stuff. Back to the exhaust system for a second. The exhaust of these heavy-duty diesels doesn't stop right at the turbo. The exhaust also passes through something called an after-treatment system. Diesel exhaust is full of chemicals and compounds that are considered harmful to the environment. That's why the exhaust systems of modern diesels have been designed to reduce or eliminate large amounts of these compounds. Some of these systems include the DOC, which stands for the diesel oxidation catalyst. Its job is to reduce carbon monoxide and hydrocarbons. The DPF, or diesel particulate filter. It's designed to capture soot and requires a process called regeneration, which we'll cover in a future video to burn off some of this soot. And SCR, selective catalytic reduction, which uses another fluid called DEF, or diesel exhaust fluid. Very different from diesel fuel, but we'll get into that in a little future video, which helps to reduce NOx or nitrogen oxides. These systems are designed to help meet emissions regulations and keep engines running clean. Let's quickly recap that 4-stroke diesel cycle one more time. As during the intake stroke, the piston is traveling down, clean air comes from the intake manifold past the open intake valves of the cylinder head and enters the cylinder. At the bottom of that first intake stroke, the intake valves close, which seals off the cylinder. At this point, the piston starts coming back up, and the compression stroke begins when air is squeezed super tight and super hot. As the piston nears the top of the stroke, fuel is injected at extremely high pressures through the fuel injector where it instantly ignites inside the cylinder. This combustion pushes the piston down and is known as the power stroke. After the power stroke, the burnt air fuel mixture exhaust gases need to be removed, so the piston is traveling back up in the cylinder in the exhaust stroke. And the exhaust valves are opened to allow all of those gases to escape out the exhaust manifold towards the turbo and the exhaust after treatment system. Now, we started with the intake air system, followed the air to where it mixes with the fuel. We followed it to where it combusts during the power stroke, and it eventually leaves the exhaust system. This perfectly timed dance of air, fuel, compression, and combustion delivers the torque that powers the world's heaviest machinery. But how does this timing work? How do the valves know when to open and close? Well, you can watch this video next to learn a little bit more about that process.